TRW, the game I have out, of course, is Assault, Tactical Combat in the 80s. Let's see, this is Assault proper. As a matter of fact, I have partially set up Scenario 1 with US NATO, US, I guess they label it here, US Force Level 1 and Soviet Force Level 1, but anyways, I will get to that later. Looking over the Assault game material. By the way, this video is not going to be on Assault yet, but I should get to it later. I should get to the game itself later, but Cliff Notes version right here. Just a great game. Yeah, as a game, a great creation here, great work. But I'll get to that later in its proper place. Looking over the game materials, it comes with a briefing booklet, which I'm actually going to be taking a look at, or I plan to take a look at. I will be taking a look at, and I plan to put it on video, I guess is the way I should say that. And again, I'll talk about why the game is out again and all that stuff later. But really, glancing over the briefing booklet, Assault, Tactical Combat in the 80s, they reference AirLand battle, the doctrine that was official for the U.S. Army at this time, both when the game is set and actually when the game came out. I believe. I don't have the dates in front of me, but I believe it was current doctrine at the time. So yeah, looking at the briefing booklet, glancing it over, I thought actually, for a couple of different reasons, I am going to get myself even more into the spirit of the game. I thought I would go back and take a look. So I thought I'd go back and review FM 100-5 again to get myself into the mental frame of the game. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk about Assault, but man, well, we need a lot more games like this. But again, I'll get to variations on that theme later. Let's talk about AirLand battle. But basically, the point about this is that you have a war game here, a war game system actually, a war game system designed around what was then current Army, U.S. Army doctrine. Pretty cool thing. Let's see. But AirLand battle is interesting in and of itself. So I'm just going to be talking about it again. I'm getting myself mentally into the frame for the game, into a mental frame for playing the game. So AirLand battle. There's a lot of good history out there. And I'm not, so I'm not summarizing anything. What I am doing is I'm talking about, well, this is just my commentary. I am a career Army officer. I've served in Training and Doctrine Command, which is the 4-star Army, U.S. Army command that handles doctrine. AirLand battle was doctrine. I say that because I'm using doctrine in the narrow, specific term, not a vague way here. So AirLand battle proper first came out in FM 100-5, 1982, or you can call it 100-5, 82. Again, that's the addition of FM, that's Field Manual 100-5, which is always it was always operations. It's a different numbering system used today. But up until the numbering system changed, which I think was after 2000. I think Yeah, I think sometime between 2000 and I think 2010, 11 maybe. Anyways, so FM 100 for decades was the operations manual. As the operations manual for the U.S. Army, that is the highest doctrinal manual. It was for many, many decades. In other words, there wasn't a doctrinal manual that was higher, organizationally higher than operations. That doesn't mean there were not different kinds of documents that were higher, but there was not a doctrinal publication, i.e. official, higher than 100-5 for the Army. Yeah, it came out, AirLand Battle comes out first in 1982, and it is significantly revised and redone and reworded in 1986. So 4 years later, AirLand Battle comes out again, and I think by a number of different authoritative accounts, the 1982 version is good, but it was not complete. And so by a number of authoritative accounts, the 1986 revision was a second attempt to get it right. So it's interesting to make a lot of comparisons between the 82 and 86 editions, but that's really a separate matter if you're really into this stuff, like I am. So obviously, actually I should say AirLand Battle was not officially replaced until a number of years later, 1993. And right there, by my little humble opinion, that's a fact that has escaped a lot of people's attention. But again, that's a whole other story about the evolution of U.S. Army doctrine. The revision and the replacement of AirLand Battle, which I'm not going to get into what happens in the 90s, but it is replaced in 1993, even though, again, that point is missed by a lot of people. A lot of people who are in this and involved in this miss that point. So AirLand Battle really only exists officially from 1982 until 1993. Now, of course, people say, well, in effect, it existed for longer. Yeah, sure, you can say that, but that's more misleading than anything. Again, that's another story about how U.S. Army doctrine evolves through the 90s, and then the impact of 9/11 on Army doctrine. But those are other chapters. So back to the kind of the golden era of AirLand Battle, essentially the 80s. Obviously, AirLand Battle is the Army doctrine in place, official, and trained to, and executed by the U.S. Army in Operation Desert Storm. So there is that to consider. Okay, so looking back at FM 100-582, so the first incarnation, the first attempt at AirLand Battle. What to say here? In the preface, fundamental mission of the United States Army is to deter war. Should conflict occur, FM 100-5 is the Army's keystone how-to fight manual. Okay, so again, that's part of what I already said about FM 100-5 was considered the capstone, or keystone might even be. Well, keystone's the term they use here. You might also say capstone. It's the head of the arch. It's the top of the arch for all Army doctrine. All Army doctrine flows down and out from 100-5. Did at this time. All right. FM 100-5 explains how the Army must conduct campaigns and battles in order to win. It's based on the purpose, organization, responsibilities, and goals of the U.S. Army set forth in FM 100-1. So that's the field manual for the Army. The Army as an organization and service, I guess you could say. All right, so it is very interesting. I'm not going to look at it here, but it is interesting to consider how these different FMs in different years, in different incarnations, how they were organized. I'm not going to go into that here, but I'm going to say that for 1982's edition of AirLand Battle, Chapter 1 is Challenges for the U.S. Army, which is a good place to start. Chapter 2, though, is Combat Fundamentals. So it's kind of interesting. You're talking about operational concepts, levels of war, and dynamics of battle. And it's interesting that the whole chapter is called Combat Fundamentals. Interesting way of looking at operations. Chapter 3 is actually weather and terrain, including urbanized terrain and special environments. Is this a reflection of the importance of weather and terrain of Central Europe? Probably. On the impact of those things on Army doctrine, Army operations doctrine, probably. Chapter 4 is battlefield environments. So you could say going even more specialized, nuclear and chemical weapons, electronic warfare, smoke and obscurance. Again, an expression of the NATO Warsaw Pact competition in the 80s, the envisioned Central European and then Western European battlefields. Okay, Chapter 5, combat service support, logistics basically. Chapter 6, tactical intelligence. Interesting that intelligence gets its own chapter, is what it is, but it includes intelligence collection, intelligence operations, and tactical counterintelligence. Interesting way to look at it, but the point being, of course, that intelligence has of course, intelligence is always important in warfare, but intelligence had an outsized role for the Army in the 80s, for the Cold War period, for the envisioned operations against the Warsaw Pact, and for AirLand Battle. That all, you could say, flows one to the other. So not surprising that tactical intelligence has its own chapter. Chapter 7 is conduct of operations, so AirLand Battle fundamentals, command and control, planning and coordination, all definitely clearly emphasized in AirLand Battle. Then you break it out into the offensive operations first. You have a couple of chapters on offensive operations, from fundamentals to basically types of offensive operations, including movement to contact, attacks, exploitation, and pursuit. Then you go to defensive operations. You actually have let's see, you have you have more chapters devoted to the defense, which is interesting. You know, what to make of that. Specifically, again, the fundamentals. You always have a fundamentals of the offense, fundamentals of, or that's a very, very, very common pattern for U.S. Army doctrine, anyways. But then you have, did I hit my microphone? The defense. You have techniques and preparation. You have retrograde operations, breakout of encircled forces. It's always interesting. It's always interesting when any force includes that in their doctrine. But clearly, breakout of encircled forces was considered an important element of the Cold War setting, of the specific fights envisioned against the Soviet Union and the fighting in Central and then Western Europe. Then you have rear area protection, also considered part of the defense. So the defense still has more to it. Of course, I'm emphasizing that because the common story, what do you want to call it? The popular story. The popular story is that AirLand Battle was this vast rejection of the doctrine that came before, which is 1976, which was active defense. Active defense, 1976, was considered too defensive. That popular story, there's a lot more to it than that. It was not that clean, not that simplistic. But it's interesting that when AirLand Battle is touted as this fundamentally offensive doctrine, in FM 100-5, which is the place to look for the answers, the defense is still much more complicated, has more going on, has more. It's a bigger subject matter, and that's again, that's kind of a pattern of U.S. Army doctrine, which is interesting to look at over the decades. What's involved in the offense and what's involved in the defense. Just a thumbnail comparison. Just think about it. Offensive operations has 2 chapters. The defense has 5. Okay, so part 2 of the FM, the field manual, is the offensive operations, comprising 2 chapters. And by the way, these chapters are not unusually different in length. Then you have part 3, which is the defense, made up of 5 chapters. What I'm emphasizing is there's a lot more going on with the defense than the offense. Then you have part 4, which is actually joint contingency and combined operations, exactly as you would expect. NATO, combined operations in the Pacific, and then combined operations in other contingency areas or theaters of operation, theaters of command. All right. So not to be, well, wasn't the intent to get into any detail there, but it is interesting, and it's always important to the FMs are always a lens or a window into the times, and a lot of tiny little things, the choice of a word here, choice of a word there, ordering of chapters here, all of these little things are sometimes, that's pretty bad language there, but there are, in and amongst all these details, are clues, which give you even more insight to the times and the era. So that's why I was going through that. Now, part 1, the Army and how it fights. These are kind of the fundamentals. Chapter 1, again, challenges for the Army. It starts out, it has a good kind of setting paragraph. It is short, to the point. Again, I'm not going to talk about it, but the FMs, well, this FM, what I'm going to give you right now is more concise than what we have today, especially after 2000, which has nothing to do with the year. But after 2000, our field manuals have really gotten incredibly wordy. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with the year. It has to do with, well, I'm not going to say I know exactly why it is, but I believe it's because of the everything being digital. Basically, when these things had to be done manually, like in 1982, there was a reason to be concise. And I think today that you have today's version of FM 100-5, which actually maybe I should take a look at sometime here on video. But I mean, it's one of those situations where, because everything is digital, it's almost like nothing is thrown out, and it's a mess. It's a mess. All right, so there is no simple formula for winning wars. This is kind of like the fundamental philosophical viewpoint or outlook here that underpins AirLand battle. Defeating enemy forces in battle will not always ensure victory. So this is right off the bat. Just because you win battles or just because you win a battle doesn't mean you're going to win the war. Other national instruments of power and persuasion, interestingly, and persuasion will influence or even determine the results of wars. So it's interesting. It's right off the bat. The FM is trying to say, yes, wars are much bigger, more complex, more dynamic than just the issue of fighting and winning battles. Wars cannot be won, however, without a national will and military forces equal to the task. So now the authors are flipping it around to say, yes, while wars are not reduced to battles, you can't win a war without committing forces equal to the will, the national will. and it goes on, although successful military operations do not guarantee victory, they are an indispensable part of winning. All right, so there you go. You have those forces. They need to reflect a requisite national will to win. And what do those forces do? They conduct operations. There will be battles involved, but the battles themselves do not determine victory. But they are an indispensable part of winning. Winning campaigns and battles is the focus of this manual. So they're in one nice, concise paragraph of 4 sentences. The authors take it from a very broad philosophical down to this field manual is about waging campaigns and fighting and winning battles. Excellent setting. And then we go on identifying the challenges. Let's see. So this is another thing that this is just a thumbnail rule. This is just a rule of thumb, but it's worked for me. When you pick up an FM from an era, a past FM from an era, or the current FM, okay. When you pick up an FM, look in the first chapter or the first part, or look early on in the text, and you should find some type of a section that kind of maps out, again, it maps out the philosophical direction of the entire doctrine. And you can see little, pretty clear signposts usually. So in this section, you have a few paragraphs. It's talking about, it's talking about different situations the Army is going to find itself. It must be ready to fight light, well-equipped forces such as Soviet-supported insurgents or sophisticated terrorist groups. It's interesting. I always find it fascinating to find these tiny little references going back decades that foreshadow events much later. But it does say, it's kind of setting again a perspective that there will be major engagements planned against high-tech Soviet forces, but the Army will do many other things. So it must also prepare to fight highly mechanized forces typical of the Warsaw Pact or Soviet surrogates in Asia. So it's all interesting. And so then they talk about battles, which are likely to be intense and deadly and costly. And then, anyways, the 4 basic challenges the Army will face. The battlefield itself, and this is something that is an emphasis of air-land battle. We're talking about nuclear battlefields and chemical and electronic warfare battlefields. There's that, and then there's leadership, and then there's readiness, and then there's training. 4 basic challenges. Okay, then we go on to the next battlefield. This again is usually a very interesting when you get the prediction of what the doctrine is designed to go up against. So here we have different themes like non-linear maneuver battles. Basically, battles, can expect, future battles can expect to be, or the Army can expect future battles to be fast-moving, involving lots of maneuver because you have quite heavy forces, quite heavy mechanized forces. My words, this is saying that we cannot expect to hold a forward defensive line unbroken. We can expect to have breakthroughs and Soviet breakthroughs and Soviet exploitation and attacks in rear areas and et cetera, turning maneuvers, et cetera. Then it talks about battle lines will be indistinct. Opposing forces will rarely fight along orderly, distinct lines. There will be massive troop concentrations, but then there will also be, other types of enemy threats. Mixing of conventional nuclear and chemical fires, unconventional warfare, active reconnaissance, etc., electronic warfare, etc. Then we go into lethal systems. This, of course, is kind of the up front, the realization that future enemies will probably have large numbers of high-quality anti-tank weapons, anti-armor weapons, precision-guided munitions, etc., etc. So kind of reaching back to the lessons of the 73 Arab-Israeli War here. Then we talk about sensors and communications. Kind of interesting that's highlighted here early on in the talking about the future of battle. Nuclear and chemical warfare, obviously, command and control. So here's where we talk about given everything it's talking about, and that includes both fast-moving mechanized forces and tactical nuclear weapons. Commanders are going to have a hard time figuring out and keeping straight what's going on. Commanders will be required to operate with far less than perfect intelligence and knowledge about what's going on. So here emphasizes initiative and continuing to exercise effective command and control, even if units are basically cut off. Then we go to air systems, air mobility, and air power. So now we really have the first inclination about air-land battle. By the way, air-land battle is not that term is not highlighted here anywhere. It comes to be known as air-land battle, but for good reason. It's not that it was. Air-land battle was a known term, but you don't have air-land battle on every page. Actually, far from it. Anyways, here you have the first inclination that air is going to be a big part. Air mobility and air power will extend the battle to the whole extended battlefield, the deep battle. These are ideas that led to air-land battle here. So to new depths, effective air defenses, air superiority by one combatant could represent a significant advantage in the conduct of operations. So control of that tactical air and air over the deep battle is more important than ever, you might say. Then we have austere support, rear area combat, urban combat, and desert combat. Then we go to leadership. Oh yeah, so we're breaking down each of the components. We've got leadership, readiness, and then training. So under training, by the way, they start talking about the complexities of modern combat and the importance of a focused unit training, all stuff that was actually carried out, was actually implemented and very successfully. So then we go to the next section of the chapter, meeting the challenges. So here we're talking about the character of modern battle. Here it is. So here we have the air-land battle doctrine presented in the following chapters, right? So we have the character of modern battle and geographical range of U.S. national interests make it imperative that the Army fight as part of a team with the tactical forces of the Air Force and Marine Corps and Navy. It is also critical that commanders prepare themselves to fight alongside the forces of one or more nations' allies. All right. So here we talk about the air-land battle doctrine presented in these chapters outlines an approach to fighting intended to develop the full potential of U.S. forces. All right, now we talk about, this is probably a good place to wrap up here, but at the end of the chapter, it sums it up, and interestingly, and actually very fittingly, it goes back to the extended battlefield. So by extending the battlefield and integrating conventional nuclear, chemical, and electronic means, forces can exploit enemy vulnerabilities anywhere. The battle extends from the point of close combat to the forces approaching from deep in the enemy rear. That's deep battle. Fighting this way, the U.S. Army can quickly begin offensive action by air and land forces to conclude the battle on its terms.